Record on this computer. Perfect. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm glad everybody could join us for this webinar. Today, we're going to talk to Brian Ambrette. He joined the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy in 2014 to lead the Coastal Resilience Program. And you've seen some of this on our Sakai core site website, but the program provides rural local governments with assistance and resources to prepare for sea level rise, coastal hazards, and climate change impacts. He works with Eastern Shore leaders to assess the risks associated with sea level rise and plan resilience into their communities. Brian has worked with the Nature Conservancy in Connecticut on conservation and planning tools for coastal resilience, and with the Environmental Defense Fund in fundraising and donor engagement. He has a master's in Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, focusing on marine and coastal resource management and stakeholder engagement. His undergrad degree is in physics and geology from Middlebury College in Vermont. I think many of you know that college here. So with that, Brian, I'll let you take over. We're going to go until 6 o'clock. We'll be done by then. So before that, we will definitely have a lot of ample time for questions, discussion, etc. So it's all yours now, Brian.
Great. Thanks, Krista. Thanks for having me. And this is, it's great to be back doing another webinar with Antioch. I did one probably about 2 years ago now, when we had just kind of launched the partnership that I'm going to talk about tonight. So it's nice to come back and give an update to that. We did launch this partnership with Antioch and their assistance. And so it's good to be able to feed this back into the community there, help with the learning, and pass along some lessons. So I look forward to having some dialogue with you all at the end of the session tonight. With that, we will get started here. So my plan for this evening is to run through what you see here on the screen. We'll talk a little bit about my organization, the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, and how we got into coastal resilience work. Talk a little bit about the landscape where we are, Maryland's Eastern Shore, a bit about why regional collaboration is a model that works for us, and then talking about getting the Eastern Shore Climate Adaptation Partnership off the ground, and talk a bit about our work and some of our approaches to collaboration, and then wrap up with some notes on our progress. So that's where we're going tonight. The Eastern Shore Land Conservancy started in 1990 as a traditional land trust doing preservation work for a rural landscape here. We work across 6 counties that you can see in the upper corner there on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. So this is on the Delmarva Peninsula. 6 of the 9 Maryland counties on that peninsula are in our service area. We have a number of programs that we've expanded beyond traditional land preservation and stewardship. We have a Center for Towns that works to strengthen rural small towns and villages, the Coastal Resilience Program that I'm going to talk about tonight, and then some work around what we call rural prosperity, but really trying to bring new economic opportunity to resource-based economies. So we have a large ag sector and a large fishery-based sector here that's driving our economy. And so we're trying to bring more lifeblood into those sectors of the economy. And then lastly, as the photograph here shows, about 3 years ago, we renovated this building in the downtown, the core of one of our towns. It had been abandoned and derelict for about 2 decades. It was an old industrial building that actually did the laundry for the region. And we purchased it and renovated it. And now it houses a number of nonprofit conservation-themed organizations, a couple of small entrepreneurial businesses, and mixed-use residential apartments as well. So we are committed to protecting the landscape, and that meant when we had the opportunity to expand into this building to move our footprint into a downtown core, taking some of that pressure off the landscape. So we have a number of interesting facets to our region. This is the town of Oxford, obviously a coastal town. It's one of the oldest ports of entry in the United States. It was at one point the largest port in the state of Maryland, and that has since been superseded by Annapolis and Cambridge and Baltimore. But this is the historic town of of Oxford. And as you can see, it's still very much a water-dependent community. Not just the marinas and recreational uses and tourism, but also a thriving fishing operation out of here. In the Chesapeake Bay, we're doing fishing, we're doing crabbing, we're doing oystering, and just about every town along the water's edge will have pretty strong fishing influence in its town-based economies. We're also very much an agricultural region. That is the dominant land use across the Maryland portion of Delmarva. And that is, pretty unique. We're about 60 to 90 minutes from the Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia corridor. So we're hoping that the region, becomes a food shed for the urban areas that are right next door. But being that close to such a developed portion of the country means there's a lot of development pressure on our landscape. And so protecting the farm, protecting the waterfronts is a core part of our mission. But also helping these regions think about the other challenges that rural communities, rural regions across the country are facing, not just with climate change, but demographic trends, boom and bust cycles of development, outmigration of our young people, and access to healthcare, broadband. All of those are issues here, despite being so close to those urban corridors of the East Coast. And then adding on top of that, we have the issues of climate change and sea level rise. The Delmarva Peninsula is one of the lowest lying portions of the US. We like to say that we're the third most vulnerable region to sea level rise behind South Florida and Louisiana. And as you can see from this photograph, there's quite a bit that's at risk. And including a lot of our heritage sites and pieces of the social fabric like this cemetery that are literally going underwater and falling into the Chesapeake Bay. So to give you an idea of what we're expecting here as far as sea level rise, we're expecting a 2-foot rise by 2050 and somewhere between 5 and 6 feet by the end of the century. And that is roughly twice the global average. The Chesapeake Bay region, the mid-Atlantic, is still experiencing some of the rebound from the weight of the glaciers 14,000 years ago. So as you all know, the New England area is rebounding upward from the release of the weight of those glaciers. And we're at the other end of the waterbed down here. We are sinking as New England rises. And so that sinking combined with the global sea level rise means that we have a rate of sea level rise that is about double the global average and one of the fastest rates in the US. We are experiencing sea level rise already and its impacts on communities and life on the Eastern Shore. As this photograph shows, we're losing some of our heritage sites. We do have in some of our communities disruptions to the abilities of folks to get to and from work, of children to get to and from school. We're having impacts on some of our built infrastructure and even on mobile assets that either families or communities own. A lot of people in some of our communities have saltwater cars for days when the water is over the road. And that's the image in the opening slide of the sky reflecting off the road. That can be a regular old Tuesday in some parts of our region. And, no storm associated with that. Could be a sunny day. And that is very real in our region. In addition to sea level rise, we are experiencing changes in rainfall patterns. We've had in other parts of the states, we've had a couple of 1,000-year rain events months in the last 5 years. We are experiencing changes in rainfall, shifts in rainfall patterns to the winter and the spring, and then drier summertime and fall periods, punctuated by these very intense downpours. And that has impacts on the farm community and on the health of the Chesapeake Bay, because all of that rain lands on the farming landscape or in our towns and washes nutrients and pollution into the bay. And so that's complicating matters for restoring the health of the Chesapeake Bay. And we're fortunate here in Maryland that we do have some very strong state policies that are starting to combat the causes of climate change. We have an RPS plan in place. We have greenhouse gas goals for the state. So we have strong policies on the climate mitigation side. And I think the next sort of front on the state policy will be work to strengthen adaptation assistance to communities. And we'll talk about one piece of that later tonight. But locally here on the Eastern Shore, we do have some political and capacity challenges in our rural communities. This is not much different than rural communities across the country. And so tonight what I'm going to talk about is the Eastern Shore Climate Adaptation Partnership, which is our attempt to overcome some of those challenges, particularly the capacity challenge, but also the political challenge. So the Eastern Shore Climate Adaptation Partnership, or the ESCAP, ESCAP, as we call it here, was started about 3 years ago under a joint grant with Antioch. It started as a facilitated community of practice with several staff from local governments and state agencies and a couple of the nonprofits and universities in the area. It started as a pilot project to see if folks were interested and wanted to keep it going. And ultimately they did. So we'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing through the partnership. The partnership right now has representation from 6 counties, 2 towns, 4 state agencies, 4 academic institutions, and about 3 nonprofit organizations. And so our mission is to provide resources and assistance to the local government. So we really do view the agencies, the universities, and the NGOs as service and capacity providers, helping the communities to lower the barriers to doing the climate adaptation and resilience work. On the local government side, we have folks from the planning community, from emergency management, from public health, from public works and engineering, from flood insurance and floodplain management. From the university, we have folks from extension and science communication. So it really does bring a good swath of expertise and roles to bear on the challenge of doing adaptation in rural communities. Over the years, we have seen a number of benefits come out of this regional collaboration. I've highlighted a number of them on the screen for you here, and highlighted the ones that I think are the most important that we're taking advantage of at the moment. And so while you're looking over those, I'll talk a little bit about how we got this collaboration off the ground. It really started about 4 years ago as ESLC was trying to figure out what is the best way to serve really a large geography of 6 counties, and to do that effectively and efficiently. And so Eastern Shore Land Conservancy had pretty good relationships already with the land use planning community, and we really built on that. And they were the first people that we invited to participate in the community of practice. And we expanded that out to include emergency management and public health officials. And from there, it's grown to include the rest of those roles that I described just a moment ago. And we were fortunate to have Antioch's experience having started communities of practices in other states, and sort of combine forces to bring the 2 organizations' experiences to bear on the significant shared vulnerabilities that we have across this region. And so it was important in those first couple of meetings to emphasize that these 6 communities, which tend to see themselves as unique from one another, do have a number of shared vulnerabilities and a number of shared capacity constraints. And it wasn't too difficult to convince the staff level folks that the taking a regional approach and a collaborative approach was going to help them do their jobs better. And then ESLC brought the backbone logistical support to the network, the scheduling the meetings, the follow through, and just being the communication hub for the community of practice. So as I said, we did this in a number of phases. We started with a 3-month pilot phase with Antioch's assistance. And that was really to provide some basic education and information about climate change and get a sense of where people, where their priorities were and what kinds of assistance they wanted to get out of this partnership. Ultimately, they decided that this partnership was a good idea. We moved forward. We changed the name to the Eastern Shore Climate Adaptation Partnership. And then we went through a period of getting down on paper those shared goals, a shared vision, and ultimately a mission statement, purpose statement, vision statement, expectations and goals for the partnership. And I'd be happy to talk more about those if you all have questions about it later on. And then, so since late 2016, we've been operating under that vision and really working to bring data and tools to these communities to help them start to integrate data and the principles of adaptation and resilience into the work that they're doing in their communities. And what we found is at the staff level in all of these communities, there are very dedicated people who really want to do right by their towns and their counties and are eager for this information and are happy to have a place-based organization like ESLC coordinate efforts to bring them reliable information that they know has been tailored to the needs of rural communities, which can be quite different from the needs and capacities that urban areas have. So we really are trying to put the rural aspects of this foremost in our minds and make sure that what we deliver is able to be digested and implemented by rural communities. Let's flip through my notes here and get us caught up. So we have, over the years, really brought a number of approaches to our work, and this has been sort of a learning process about what works and what doesn't. And as I said, first and foremost, we're looking to build capacity and lower barriers for these capacity-constrained communities to do adaptation and resilience work. So for lowering barriers, we're looking at bringing down costs first and foremost, and we can, through grants, bring data and information and tools to these communities and avoid them having to hire a contractor or a consultant to get that information. And we're able to do that economically because we can do it for 6 counties at a marginally greater price than any one county could go do it alone. So we're really focusing on the cost efficiencies as a selling point to fiscally conservative and capacity and resource constrained local governments. And then second, we're working to lower the effort required to understand and digest and implement the principles, the data, all of that information, so that communities that have maybe one planner or even some of our small towns who only have a town administrator, they have the ability to take tools that have been formatted and processed and analyzed so that it brings the information right down to almost plug and play code changes, ordinance changes, and other types of implementation devices. And then lastly, this regional collaboration or coordination among multiple jurisdictions does provide some political and career risk for our members. It's much easier to step out onto the limb if you're doing it with your neighbors. So, one of the things that we're working on right now is encouraging communities to upgrade to higher floodplain management standards, going beyond the minimum FEMA requirements. And we're looking at having multiple communities doing that, so that no one community is sort of left with their necks out. And likewise, that the staff in these communities can propose these kinds of measures and know that their counterparts in their neighboring jurisdictions are doing the same thing. So it does tend to counter not just political risk, but also career risk to those staff members. And then as far as building capacity, the partnership, the obvious one is that we're sharing knowledge among the communities, but we're also a hub of activity, and we can take the position of, or use our position sort of as this hub to coordinate the priorities among the communities, and I'm going to talk about that next. We have seen some successes with facilitating this interjurisdictional, but also intra-jurisdictional collaboration. So we're starting to draw, as I said, planners, emergency managers, public health officials, even county and town administrators. So it's working to break down silos within individual jurisdictions as well, getting them a common understanding of climate change and literacy around the terms and the practices and the strategies. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as a success story later on this evening. And then lastly, we're streamlining interactions between these counties and towns and the state agencies. This gives the state agencies a single place to interact with multiple jurisdictions, and it gives the jurisdictions a single place to interact with multiple state agencies. So it's flowing in both directions, and really opening up lines of communications and understanding about what challenges the communities are having, what limitations agencies have. So it really has improved the flow of information and really improved the trust factor between and among the different levels of government in the region. So aligning priorities across the region has been something that has been very fruitful for us, and sort of started unexpectedly. We started by looking at the various planning documents that the communities have, so comprehensive plans, hazard mitigation plans, green infrastructure plans. We took all of those plans and asked the question, where are the common priorities that touch on climate vulnerabilities and resilience? And even though many of those plans never mentioned the word climate change, they all talked about things that touch on that. So whether it's stormwater management, or floodplain management, or public health concerns, we pulled those up and identified where similar language was being used among multiple jurisdictions, and then worked with communities as they go through their hazard mitigation planning cycles or their comp planning cycles, to insert common language across the communities, so that now we're in a situation where 4 or 5 or even 6 of our communities have very similar goals and priorities in some of their plans, and it makes it much easier for the partnership and for ESLC to go pursue grant funding on behalf of multiple communities, and we're able to bring not just those cost efficiencies to the jurisdictions, but it also makes our grant applications more competitive because we're able to serve multiple jurisdictions at once. So the types of things, some other types of things that we're aligning, we're looking at, well, we had one success. We were able to put a priority into multiple plans for getting access to high resolution sea level rise data and mapping, and we fulfilled that priority this past year. All of our communities are either enrolled in the community rating system or are very interested in it. All of our communities have stormwater management concerns and needs. And so in the coming year, we'll be kicking off a study of extreme precipitation, looking to understand how those historical trends in precipitation can be quantified and projected out into the future so that we can give guidance on intensity, duration, and frequency of rainfall events, and guidance on design storm for our engineers and our stormwater managers. We have common language across multiple jurisdictions on capital investment planning and infrastructure maintenance. We have common priorities and language on open space preservation and on, again, on higher standards for floodplain management. So with all those commonalities, we, as a partnership, are able to prioritize which information and which tools we want to help bring to these communities, and we can go pursue grant opportunities to do that. The next approach that we are bringing is what we're calling the science to solutions approach. And this is really saying, look, we know that science is important. We want science-based strategies, or the communities to adopt science-based strategies, but they may not have the ability or the time to digest the science on their own. So we want to design all of our data projects so that we do the analysis, we pass that analysis through a local lens to figure out how that agrees or does not agree with what's observed and experienced in our communities. And then we take that data and we we provide guidance on how to include it and respond to it in planning procedures that communities are already doing. So we had on the sea level rise project that we just completed last year, we did GIS work at a local university. We then went to the Georgetown Climate Center and our Environmental Finance Center at the University of Maryland and said, can you come up with the legal guidance to update our codes, update our ordinances, and to update our capital investment planning processes so that these data are included in those codes, or those codes are responsive to that data, and that our planning and decision-making makes room to consider those changes in sea level rise. So we're at the point we have just released last week all of that GIS data and the guidance. And at the end of my presentation, I have a link where if you're interested in accessing it, you can get to it. The floodplain management guidance, the higher standards, and the capital investment planning guidance, I think would be appropriate and applicable to communities of all scales, not just rural ones, but it really was produced with the rural communities in mind. And we are, with the extreme precipitation project that I mentioned, we're looking to use the science to solutions approach again. So getting the quantitative data and then passing it through a local lens to see how it jives with what's been experienced here on the ground. And then producing guidance out of it that gets communities as close to that plug and play point as possible. So if we're talking about code and ordinance changes, we're providing the case studies of other communities that have gone through this process. We're providing the language that can be inserted into the codes or ordinances. And then we're providing legal considerations, what concerns might arise by going to higher standards. Where might you earn community rating system credits for going to higher standards? So it really is trying to take as much of the legwork out of the process, provide as much of the background and credibility that's needed to get some of these changes through not just the planning process, but the approval process as well. The next approach is what we call mainstreaming resilience. So the graphic here is just a quick selection of all the myriad plans that communities might have to do. Even in rural communities, they have most of the plans on this page. And what we really want to avoid is the need to do an extra climate adaptation plan. We think that by using, when communities go through a comprehensive plan update, they can put a number of goals in a coastal resilience or climate resilience element or chapter in that plan. And then that can filter down through all of the rest of their plans and ways that they run and make decisions in their communities. So we really are looking to help communities insert these strategies into as many points of contact with their community as possible in the ways that they're already interacting with their community and already planning. So we're trying to avoid new planning documents that will just sit on shelves. And then lastly, we're providing assistance with those individual plans. So we're frequently involved with hazard mitigation plan updates and providing some of the expertise communities would need to really understand what their sea level rise and climate hazards are. And then again, to ensure that those common priorities across jurisdictions are getting constantly revisited. So we had that first round of common language, and we're already thinking about what are the next sets of commonalities we want to see in these plans so that we can be continually innovating here and bringing new assistance and new products to communities. One of the ones I'm really excited about is a post-disaster redevelopment plan. So what do you do? How do you rebuild smart after a hurricane or a severe rainstorm or a wildfire, so that you have all of those hard decisions already made and you have a lot of projects already on the shelf that are shovel ready when federal funding comes down the pike. And then the good thing about having the resources of ESLC and our university and NGO partners is that we can react fairly quickly to new legislation or new requirements that come down from the state that communities might have to meet. So we had a new one come through the legislature last spring. It was a bill that had a number of parts, but one of those parts required all coastal communities to do a nuisance flood plan. So a plan that would designate how a community will respond to sunny day flooding or tidal flooding that is not driven by a storm event. And as some of the slides I showed you earlier show, that's a real issue here in some of our communities. They're dealing with it on a weekly or monthly basis. So we were in a position to pull in a number of partners and work with some of the state agencies on a work group and develop guidance to help those communities respond. They were only given a year to develop those plans, and so we had to come up with guidance that made meaningful progress, but recognized that the timeline was short and most of these communities had not budgeted for the human resources or the funding to do a plan like that. So I want to give you what I was going to call 2 success stories, but we know that planning for resilience and adaptation is a very long-term process, and it will actually never end because the climate will continue to change far beyond our planning horizons. But these 2 stories are really signs of progress in this region, which until very recently had been reluctant to acknowledge that climate change was even happening. So the first story comes out of Dorchester County, which is where that photograph on the opening slide and the photograph of the gravestone underwater were taken. It is the most vulnerable county in our service area and in the region, and indeed in the country, to sea level rise. And this is a county that for the longest didn't want to acknowledge that it had a sea level rise problem. It will tell you, folks there will tell you that they have an erosion problem and a flooding problem. But they've come around, and in large part, and a couple of years ago, there was a grassroots effort to get the county enrolled in the community rating system. It was very much a bottom-up effort led by citizens, and they got the county enrolled, and they came in at a class 9. And then the staff members from various departments in the county started participating in the Eastern Shore Climate Adaptation Partnership and developing common language around the threats that they're facing. And the emergency managers and the planners and even the county grant writer really started coordinating their activities across their departments and generating some pretty novel ways of addressing some risks. They had to take baby steps because they had to move slowly around public opinion. But they've made some real progress, and just this past December, they earned a level 6 in the community rating system, which ties them with Ocean City for the highest rating in the state of Maryland. And that really does represent a good deal of progress in a short amount of time. So that's a success story of collaboration and coordination fostered within a community and within the Dorchester County that we're pretty proud of here. And for one of the most vulnerable counties in the country, in a rural county, to be that far along is really something. And then the second story is one that is very much ongoing. We have now 4 of our 6 counties are enrolled in the community rating system. A 5th is in the process of enrolling. And they're now talking to one another about collaborative ways to earn credits under the community rating system. And so one of the projects we're looking at is a collaborative program for public information. We know that the messaging around flooding and sea level rise is going to be very similar from county to county in this region. So why not work together, develop those messages together, bring the PPI stakeholder group together from multiple jurisdictions so that we're able to take a region-wide look at the vulnerabilities and the things that we can do to reduce that flood risk. And bring some economies of scale to what otherwise can be a fairly expensive process for one community to go through. So we may end up sharing printing costs, we may end up sharing mailing costs, or at least finding ways to defray some of those costs so that we can get this work done and have regional dialogue about flood risk as well. So this one's in process. We meet about every 2 months, and I think we're probably within 3 to 4 months of officially launching a program for public information. So lastly, I want to just provide a link to some materials and resources that we've developed here. The first is a white paper that goes in depth and describes the theory in our region behind regional collaboration and how we can drive prioritization of adaptation through this partnership. So it gets a little bit into the vulnerabilities for our region, but then really dives into the benefits of regional collaboration and then lays out some steps for how we can strengthen that partnership. And it was intended as kind of a manifesto that we would share with elected leaders so that they can get a better sense of what we're all about. But it really has been uptaken by our residents, and many of them have turned to that document to encourage their own town and county leaders to take this more seriously. And then all of the reporting that we produced through the Sea Level Rise project that we just completed last week has been posted to our website as well. You'll find our summary report and then all of those guidance products that I mentioned, the higher standards for floodplain management and the capital investment planning guide from the Environmental Finance Center. So I hope you'll all take a look at that, and everything that we put out there is for other folks to use. We do very much want to be a resource, not just for our own communities and our footprint here, but for other rural areas across the country, because we know that everybody is constrained, and we want to make all of this as widely used as possible. So with that, I'm happy to take on any questions that you've got or any new topics you want to discuss.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this presentation for everybody here. Maybe I can start and then open it up to everybody. Could you give a little bit more information on when you were talking about bringing the data back to the people and having them kind of truth test it with their own observations? It looked like you did a participatory process with community mapping. So was that was that just one group of folks around a table with maps, and were they looking at the data and kind of also looking at maps, and maybe did you ever find something surprising, I guess is the question, that wasn't given to you from the data that was uncovered?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we use a process called VCAPS, which I'm going to butcher the acronym here. It's Vulnerability, Consequences, and Planning Scenarios. And there's a website for it. It's vcapsforplanning.org. That's VCAPS forplanning.org. And it was developed by the North Carolina, South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium. And it really lays out a process for doing that, not just collaborative or participatory mapping, but conversation mapping that makes sure that you are capturing all of the voices in the room in a systematic way. So that was the process we used. Did we find, so the way that process works is you go through, in the lead up to some community workshops, you do a series of interviews with the stakeholders that you're going to invite to that workshop. And those are interviews that are either one-on-one or in very small groups. And that's kind of it gives you a sense of what local knowledge they're going to bring and how to mesh that with some of the scientific data that you're going to bring. And so, yeah, we learned a number of interesting things, but one of the most interesting things that we learned was not so much related, not to points on a map, but who holds information in these communities. And, often these counties have a single or one or two people who are involved, make the decisions around the road maintenance and road infrastructure. And so we met with the county roads director for one of our counties and literally flipped through a Rand McNally atlas, and he circled all of the areas with page by page that flooded. So he had all of that information in his head, but had never put it down on maps or never communicated it to other departments. And so we were able to take his map book with his circles on it and give it to the GIS specialist for the county, and she digitized it all, and now they've got this pretty accurate map of where it floods, and lo and behold, it matches up with the science data shows them.
That's great. So if anybody has a question, if you want to just pop it in the chat, or you can just start to unmute yourself, that would be great. In the meantime, it looks like Megan has something. Brian, what do you see as the single biggest challenge you deal with day to day? And how do you manage motivation or action plans to address this?
That's a great question. So, the biggest challenge is that these rural communities have enormous challenges that are unrelated to climate change, but are exacerbated by climate change. So as I mentioned, we have outmigration of our youth, we have economic challenges, demographic and social challenges, and a lot of those are much more immediate than the issue of climate change. And so, we are constantly having to describe how climate change is making those issues much more difficult, and will make those more difficult to manage in the future. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is elevating climate change to a level of urgency on par with the school needs a new roof, and we've got demographic changes and things like that.
Yeah, and it seems like Adam has it almost is a piggyback kind of question, because it talks about the political obstacles that you guys have faced. And he was wondering if you could comment on how you achieve some of that increase in political stakeholder capacity, and if there are any specific victories you could share with everybody.
Yeah, so that's an ongoing process,
Yeah.
and it's not complete, and it's a lot harder than I may have made it sound.
Mm-hmm.
We do have, most of our counties have a majority conservative viewpoints on their elected bodies. So, we're up against the national dialogue about climate change. Fortunately, or unfortunately, fortunately, we do see impacts. And so most people want to have conversations about flooding in their communities. Most people will acknowledge that it's raining differently than it used to. So we start there and we have conversations about those things. And then, we progress into conversations about how that's going to change in the future and what impacts it's going to have on how elected leaders, how their staff run their communities. And, the longer we go here, the more and more information that comes along that helps us make those cases. And recently we've seen the credit rating agencies get into the game here, and the insurance companies starting to take climate risk much more seriously. And that will, I think, very quickly and very noticeably affect the ability of our jurisdictions to get funding for some of the projects they want to do. Education has been a challenge. There's only so much information you can convey in a 15-minute presentation to a county council. We've hosted a number of workshops that we invite those elected leaders to. We've actually had more success getting educational opportunities in front of planning commissions because they're not elected in our region. They're appointed, but they're not elected. So they have a little bit more freedom to participate in things like this. And they ultimately influence the elected leaders. So if you can find those influencers in your community, the people that your elected leaders listen to, whether it's planning commissions or chambers of commerce, that's a really great way to build the awareness and build the support that you need.
Yeah. And Elise is asking a question that I think I always ask everybody I talk to, because I'm always curious to see if this has been done successfully. But has there been any talk about relocation for whether it's residents or neighborhoods in the extreme flood risk areas?
Yeah, so this is a difficult topic. This is the third rail of climate change. And that conversation is happening, I would say it's happening behind closed doors. It's not happening in the open yet, right. But it's happening behind a number of surprising closed doors. So it's a topic that we're starting to discuss, really in how do we discuss it with our community members. But even within the community, it depends on the venue that you talk about relocation. If we were to go and have a public meeting where we were going to talk about retreat and talk about relocation, we'd probably get booed out of the room because that's uprooting communities that have been here for 400 years. And that's not an exaggeration. We have communities that have been here for 400 years and people who can trace their roots all the way back to pre-colonial or colonial days anyway, some to pre-colonial, because we do have a number of native populations here. But if you go talk to folks in some of these same communities in their home at their kitchen table, they'll tell you, yeah, I'll take a buyout opportunity as soon as it comes. So in the private of their own home, they're happy to talk about relocation or buyouts, but they don't want to be seen doing it publicly because it really does start to get at those issues of social fabric and heritage and connection to the landscape. So it's challenging. I do suspect we're one storm away from being able to have a more open conversation about that.
Yeah. Anton, I'm going to unmute you. I think you have a question, and feel free to ask it once your mic is working.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian, for speaking with us. I just had a question regarding kind of the regionalized approach. Where I'm from, we can get a lot of town buy-in on a lot of this. But when it comes to getting everybody to act accordingly in a regionalized approach, there seems to be some trickiness there. I was wondering if you have any experience with that or what your thoughts are on that. If you have a way of going about that to make towns really want to come together to take action instead of trying to do things all on their own.
Yeah, good question. So the answer is we don't. We don't push for coordinated action. What we do is give communities the tools and information to make decisions on their own timelines, recognizing that different communities are in different places in planning cycles. They're in different places as far as public opinion and politics go. So we're not saying that by the end of 2019, X, Y, and Z communities need to make ABC change to their codes and ordinances. We're giving them the information to do it on their own timeline. That said, things like the community rating system and the program for public information, where everybody's got to do public messaging anyway. Is there a way we can figure out how to do it together in a way that's not committing communities to do new activity, but is helping communities do things they're already required to do? That's where we found the ability to coordinate and to do projects together.
Yeah. And then one more question, this might be the last one tonight, we'll see, is from Susanna. In Dorchester County, what was it that convinced the county employees as well as the residents to switch their perspective from erosion flooding problem to climate change is real? If they did, and kind of two parts to this, are these seasonal or year-round residents you're dealing with?
All very good questions.
Yeah.
So for the county staff, it was not so much convincing that climate change is real. I think most of them were already in their own personal minds on board with that. It was giving them a space to talk safely with their colleagues about it.
Right.
And then that led to confidence in being able to talk more broadly among their peers and then ultimately among their elected leaders about it. That is not a process that's finished yet. And indeed, every election cycle, you kind of have to restart that. And then, I think, again, it's still very much a work in process to sway the public opinion. And it's not so much convincing them that they don't have an erosion or flooding problem, that they do have a climate change problem. They very much have an erosion and flooding problem, and that's how they're experiencing climate change. And so they may disagree with climate change for a number of reasons, but the impacts that they're seeing on the ground are real, and they know that it's accelerating. And so we deal with those issues as an entry point to have larger conversations about longer term trends. So that's ongoing. It's not complete. It's not perfect. It's not easy. But that's where we are with that. And then to the question about are they seasonal or year-round, that's a challenge that we have in all of our communities, is that we do have a number of seasonal residents. We also have a number of people retiring here with much shorter time horizons on their investments in property. So that's challenging. Some people will say, yeah, I can deal with this for 15 or 20 years in my retirement, but I don't have to worry about it much farther beyond that.
Yeah.
So we do have to craft messages for all of those different audiences.
Great. And then one more question, Brian, does your organization work with the ag sector? And if so, how is that acclimating to all of the flooding?
Yes, we do. And I think that's one of the areas that we haven't tapped into as completely as we should yet. But when we talk to farmers, they will absolutely tell us that it's raining differently than it used to. And that's principally how they're experiencing climate change on their farm, is the changes in rainfall. And so what they're seeing is that the rainfall is shifting towards the winter and spring months. The last couple of years, the farmers have really been hammered by spring rains. And down here, the soil needs to dry out for a period of time after the winter before they can get their seeds in the ground. And then the window of opportunity for those seeds to mature into crops that are able to withstand the summer heat and drought is getting compressed. So it's staying wet longer in the spring, and the heat is setting in earlier in the summer, so that planting window and maturity window for the crops is really getting squeezed. And this past year in particular, we saw a number of farmers who lost their crops because they either planted too early or planted too late. And it's just really hard to make those timing decisions when the weather is so dynamic.
Yeah. Well, lots of stuff going on, and I think you guys have quite a few success stories to talk about. Even though you said it's iterative process, I understand that, and it's going to be always ongoing. But I think there's just a lot of pretty good regional engagement that's gone on in your area because of what Eastern Shore Land Conservancy has done and your work. So I really thank you for coming to talk to us tonight. I'm just going to put it out there for the folks that are on this live. If you walk away from this and you have a burning question or a question that you didn't get a chance to ask, just send it to me. Brian, just so you know, what I do is I collect a few questions from folks from afterward that had a time to digest the information, and folks that were not able to be on but watch the recording. And I will send them on to you, and hopefully you can give a few quick short answers I can give back to folks.
Absolutely.
And then I post it for both their sites. But again, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. We really appreciate it. And I look forward to continuing to hear the work that you guys are doing and how it unfolds in the next, couple months, etc. So
great. Thanks very much. Appreciate it. And happy to help. Give a ring down here anytime you guys want to chat.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody. Everybody I hope you have a good night tonight.